Hey heroes, and welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics to get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins with a Chinese couple from Hong Kong, Dr. Zhan and his wife Jingyi, who migrated to the United States to build a prosperous new life for themselves. Working in the financial sector, Zhan ultimately became a successful banker, and the couple lived comfortably and affluently in California's Beverly Hills. There, the two had a daughter and expressed their joy by naming her Jubilation. Born in America to loving, wealthy parents, the young Jubilation Lee, or Jubilee as she would come to be known, naturally spent much of her free time at the Hollywood Mall. Growing up, she discovered that she was naturally athletic with a talent for gymnastics, but developed a rebellious side and often got into trouble alongside her best friend, Cynthia Jennifer, or Zhan. Then one day, the two adolescent girls were caught shoplifting from the mall, and while fleeing from the police, Jubilee took a wrong turn and wound up at a dead end. Fearing she would wind up in juvie and not wanting to disappoint her parents, Jubilation began to panic, and that's when it happened. As many of you are no doubt aware, Jubilee is a mutant, born with an X gene that endowed her with superhuman abilities, and in this moment of stress, her powers awakened, allowing her to blind the cops with a colorful display of exploding energy and escape through a hole in the chain-link fence that had blocked her exit. Initially frightened by her own powers, she felt like her hands were burning and instinctively doused them in water, but eventually began to learn how to properly wield her newfound ability to generate multicolored plasmoids that exploded upon mental command. With practice, she learned to control the shape and intensity of these fireworks, as they became known, from sparklers and streamers that produced a harmless light show to powerful energy globules that could detonate with considerable force. She did tell her parents about her mutant nature, but her father wasn't terribly impressed, preferring she focus her efforts on more worthwhile pursuits. Meanwhile, a criminal by the name of Hunter Brawn was using the bank run by Zhan Li to launder large amounts of money. Zhan eventually figured this out and threatened to alert the police, but before he could, Brawn hired a pair of hitmen known as Reno and Molokai to eliminate the Li family. The two assassins abducted Zhan and Jingyi and staged a car accident, making their deaths seem accidental. While all of that was happening, Jubilation was at the mall with her friends, Cynthia and Jennifer, and returned home to learn the devastating news from a waiting police officer. Her next-door neighbors, a ritzy couple who coincidentally were also named Lee, offered to let her live with them. However, Jubilation resented their overtly ostentatious lifestyle and ran away. Meanwhile, by either working with or paying off Zhan's right-hand man, one Elliot Liu, Hunter Brawn successfully had Lee's bank stripped of its assets, and both men subsequently retired to Vermont, leaving Jubilee with no inheritance to speak of. With nowhere else to go, she fled to the only other place that had ever felt like home, the Hollywood Mall, and effectively lived there for a time, using her powers and gymnastics to avoid being caught by security. She regularly dazzled crowds by using her powers to generate harmless light shows, and became a petty thief to survive. Eventually, some of the mall cops grew tired of her antics and contacted a group of scientists turned fledgling mutant busters, the M Squad. While certainly not the most intimidating threat to mutant kind, the M Squad did answer the call with equipment designed to find, immobilize, and ultimately trap mutants, which proved to be overwhelming for the equally inexperienced Jubilee. Furthermore, the machines they used were corrupted and transformed by demonic energies during an event known as the Inferno, which is a whole thing that we've discussed on the channel before. Fortunately, 4 X-Men, Rogue, Dazzler, Storm, and Psylocke, just so happened to be visiting the Hollywood Mall at the same time, and the women quickly made short work of the demonic trap, saving Jubilee in the process, as well as other innocent civilians who were endangered by the M-Squad's actions. In the end, the would-be mutant busters were confronted by the police for their reckless exploits, and the X-Men slipped away. The 4 mutant women returned to their Australian headquarters through a portal generated by their Aboriginal ally, Gateway, and Jubilee, suspecting the mall was no longer safe for her, secretly followed. During this time, the X-Men were based beneath an abandoned town in the Australian Outback, which was previously occupied by a team of cyborg mercenaries called the Reavers. After arriving there, Jubilee took up residence in the tunnels beneath the town and survived by scrounging food, clothes, and other supplies while remaining largely unnoticed. The only one who initially knew she was there was Gateway, who saw her when she arrived, but he was an enigmatic mutant who rarely spoke, and so while he kept an eye on her, he never alerted the X-Men to her presence. She did have some close calls while there, like when she was attacked by a cyborg dog left behind by the Reavers, or when she was spotted by an insane cybernetic supervillain known as Nanny, but in both instances Jubilee was able to use her abilities to defend herself. Then there was an incident in which the Reavers returned to the town and ambushed Wolverine, overpowering the unsuspecting hero and crucifying him on a large wooden X. Jubilee witnessed this, and when Logan subsequently tore himself free, the teenage mutant helped him to safety, treated his wounds, and even defended him against the Reavers and their leader Donald Pierce. Bear in mind, during this time Wolverine's healing factor was still somewhat hampered by the lingering effects of the adamantium infusion that he underwent years earlier. Staying by his side, Jubilee accompanied Logan on a trip to the island nation of Madripoor, where they encountered a pair of infamous Asian crime lords, Matsuo Surayaba from Japan and the Mandarin from China. Long story short, Surayaba had brainwashed the British mutant Betsy Braddock, at the time known as Psylocke, into serving the Mandarin as an assassin, but in the end Wolverine and Jubilee successfully freed her from their mental manipulations. Those 3 stayed together in Madripoor for a time, and in the midst of these adventures, while she initially didn't care for Psylocke, Jubilee forged a strong bond with Wolverine, who ultimately became something of a surrogate father figure. Jubilee, Wolverine, and Psylocke subsequently traveled to another island nation, Genosha, where they aided various mutant teams in a larger conflict involving the notorious cyborg Cameron Hodge. In the wake of that battle, as Logan rejoined the X-Men, Jubilee joined with him and accompanied the team on a number of adventures, not all of which we'll be touching on today. Suffice it to say, despite being the youngest member of the group at the time, Jubilee was forced to prove herself quickly, as her first real adventure alongside the X-Men brought her all the way to the Shi'ar Galaxy. During a subsequent conflict with the malevolent psionic entity known as the Shadow King, Jubilee and several other mutants were mentally enslaved by the villain. In the ensuing battle, Logan was forced to incapacitate Jubilee, and after the Shadow King's defeat, he tried to convince her to quit the team, but Jubilee refused, insisting that they were partners now and that he should drop the idea of her leaving. He continued to look after her as she adventured alongside him, effectively acting as his sidekick. When the X-Men divided their forces into 2 separate strike teams, Jubilee moved into the X-Mansion and often aided the Blue Team, which of course was the division that included both Wolverine and Psylocke. There, she resumed her normal education and underwent Danger Room training under Professor Xavier, and while she was initially annoyed by this, she did come to regard him as a respected mentor and even convinced him to try rollerblading with her when he temporarily regained the use of his legs. Ultimately, the X-Mansion became her first real home since her parents died, and the X-Men became her new family. During this time, one foe she encountered on more than one occasion was the interdimensional media mogul Mojo. Amidst one such instance, Jubilee met a potential future version of herself known as Abscissa, who had been enslaved by Mojo, but by rejecting the grotesque alien's attempts to manipulate her, she ensured that such a future would not actually come to pass. Other adventures included a trip to the dinosaur-infested Savage Land, where a group of pterodactyl riders mistook her for a boy and attempted to reward her heroics by giving her a bride, much to her embarrassment. Later, she encountered a temporal portal that allowed her to look into the past and learned that her parents' deaths were not as accidental as she previously believed. She subsequently tracked down and defeated their killers, Reno and Molokai, but ultimately spared their lives, as Wolverine helped her realize that she wasn't a killer herself. However, she didn't learn who had hired them or why, and mistakenly assumed that the hitmen had targeted the wrong couple. In the weeks that followed, Jubilee would experience more tragedy with the X-Men, like when the young mutant Ilyana Rasputin succumbed to the deadly Legacy virus. In another incident, Magneto ripped the adamantium from Wolverine's skeleton, nearly killing him. Jubilee attempted to stay by his side in the aftermath of that, and Logan was shocked to find that he possessed bone claws as part of his mutation. Feeling weakened and unsure of himself, Wolverine left the team, but not before writing Jubilee a heartfelt letter saying that he loved her and would miss her. After his departure, Jubilee had a close encounter with his old enemy Sabretooth while he was imprisoned in the X-Mansion, but was fortunately aided by the time-traveling X-Man Bishop, and the two defeated Sabretooth together. As she was subsequently rethinking her place on the team, the X-Men got into a conflict with the Phalanx, a techno-organic hive mind of entities infected with the alien transmode virus. During this conflict, a number of X-Men were infected, and Jubilee joined an impromptu team alongside Synch, Banshee, and Emma Frost to combat the Phalanx and save their allies. In the midst of all of this, Jubilee had felt her powers growing stronger, but it was during the conflict with the Phalanx that she learned of her potential ability to detonate matter on a subatomic level. However, she refused to explore this upper limit to her abilities, fearing the destructive potential of it. After the Phalanx were defeated, Xavier worked with Emma Frost to reopen her Massachusetts Academy as the new Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, which would be run by Frost and Banshee and serve to steward the next generation of mutants. The Xavier estate in Westchester, meanwhile, changed its name to the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning. Taking this opportunity to say goodbye to Xavier and step away from the X-Men, Jubilee relocated to Frost's Academy, where she and her fellow students became known as Generation X. Her classmates during this time included Paige Guthrie, aka Husk, Monet St. Croix, aka M, Angelo Espinoza, aka Skin, and Everett Thomas, aka Synch. Okay, technically the M that attended the school when it first opened wasn't actually Monet St. Croix, but her two sisters, Claudette and Nicole, who had merged together to impersonate her, but, well, believe me when I say we don't have time to go on a lengthy tangent about the St. Croix siblings. The first foe that Generation X faced as a team was actually M's brother, Marius St. Croix, aka M-Plate, a vampiric mutant who needed to feed on genetic material to survive. It was during this conflict that Jubilee first met Jonathan Starsmore, aka Chamber, a mutant from London, England, whose body, a large portion of which had been destroyed by his own powers, was effectively a chamber of volatile psionic energy, hence the name. He also ended up joining the team and becoming a student at Massachusetts Academy. Gateway, still as enigmatic as ever, also hung around near the school and used his powers to deliver the real Monet St. Croix, who at the time was mystically trapped in her animalistic penance form, which prevented her from speaking or even thinking clearly. Suffice it to say, she was initially confused and distressed by her new surroundings. However, Jubilee took a liking to and befriended Penance, in a sense adopting her and naming her Penny. Amidst the group's many adventures, Jubilee began to develop a crush on her teammate Sync, and while she sometimes clashed with the others due to her outspoken and often brash nature, this lessened over time. She also had brief reunions with Wolverine, whose mutation had magnified since losing his adamantium, making it harder to control his berserker rages. While he couldn't stay with her, he told her that he was proud of her, reaffirming their father-daughter relationship. Overall, Jubilee's time with Generation X was undoubtedly a transitional period in her life, as she suddenly went from being the X-Men's inexperienced trainee to perhaps the most seasoned member of Generation X, and she took on some responsibility by looking out for her greener classmates. Of course, this team also had more adventures and exploits than we have time to delve into here. In one interdimensional incident, she encountered a masked hero from a distant cosmos named Robin, whose fashion sense she admired. The two had a brief flirtatious relationship, but were forced to fight each other when cosmic forces sought to test which universe was stronger. Their two realities were also briefly fused into a single amalgamated universe in which Jubilation Lee was Sparrow, sidekick to the Dark Claw, Logan Wayne. After everything went back to normal, during the events of Operation Zero Tolerance, Jubilee was abducted by the human Sentinel hybrid Bastion, and while she resisted his attempts to intimidate her, he ultimately succeeded in extracting from her mind the security codes to the X-Mansion. And so Jubilee felt responsible when Bastion infiltrated the mansion and accessed Xavier's files. However, one of Bastion's servants, a sentinel named Daria who resembled a young girl, developed a liking for Jubilee and took pity on her, sacrificing herself to free her. Jubilee escaped from Bastion's facility, and while she was pursued by Prime Sentinels, she was rescued by Wolverine, and the two subsequently rendezvoused with the rest of the X-Men. After Bastion's defeat, Jubilee returned to Massachusetts and finally learned the complicated truth about the St. Croix siblings, which is really a topic for another day. The important thing here is that Monet St. Croix was freed from her animalistic penance form and resented the way that Jubilee had treated her like a pet. On top of that, Monet romantically pursued Sync, who was unaware of Jubilee's crush on him. Meanwhile, with the name Xavier having been sullied by the earlier Onslaught incident, Emma Frost formally changed her school's name back to the Massachusetts Academy, and her sister Adrienne opened their doors to non-powered humans. One of the new students in the wake of this was a boy named Tristan Brawn, the grandson of the criminal Hunter Brawn. Hunter attempted to pull Tristan out of the school, sending his men to retrieve him, which led to a confrontation with Generation X, during which Hunter utilized a totem of some sort that enveloped his body in a suit of energy armor. After that initial encounter, Jubilee recognized Hunter Brawn in a photo of her parents, and in her subsequent investigation learned that he was the one who had ordered their assassination. In the end, Brawn was defeated and imprisoned as his old co-conspirator, Elliot Liu, confessed everything to the authorities. Thus, Jubilee put to rest the last lingering question about her parents' murder and finally gained some closure regarding the whole situation. When Wolverine was later enslaved by Apocalypse, who restored his adamantium skeleton and transformed him into his Horseman of Death, Jubilee was instrumental in helping Logan come to his senses and regain control of himself. When Adrienne Frost later betrayed her sister and the Massachusetts Academy, Sync was killed while trying to disarm a bomb that she'd planted in the school. In the wake of that, Jubilee and Monet bonded in their grief and buried the hatchet somewhat. However, just as Jubilee began to prove herself as a capable field leader, the fallout from Adrienne's betrayal forced the Massachusetts Academy to close their gates, and Generation X disbanded. In the wake of that, Jubilee returned home to California with Angelo Espinosa, aka Skin, who was originally from East LA. Moving to Hollywood, she attempted to embark on an acting career, but after she was repeatedly typecast into less than desirable roles, and her unscrupulous agent attempted to take advantage of her, she rejected his advances in a pretty spectacular fashion and left the industry. She subsequently joined Banshee's paramilitary organization X-Corp alongside her old teammates Husk and Monet, and the three women were collectively known as Banshee's Angels. She was then one of the mutants to be captured and crucified on the lawn of the Xavier Institute by the extremist group the Church of Humanity, much to Wolverine's shock and horror. Less injured than some of the others, she ultimately survived this experience, but her friend and ally Skin did not, which affected Jubilee more than her own wounds. She stayed at the Xavier Institute and aided the X-Men for a time, but when Cyclops later became the headmaster there, she was one of many to take umbrage with his team assignments. Meanwhile, her paternal aunt, Hope Lee, moved from China to Los Angeles, and when Hope extended an offer for Jubilation to move in with her, she accepted. She started attending a normal high school there and befriended a teenage outcast named Meg Devereaux. Meanwhile, upon investigating her background, Principal Carlton Avery was dismayed to learn of her mutant nature, but a teacher named Judy Kingsley convinced Jubilee to volunteer as a peer counselor. Initially, Jubilee had a slight crush on the high school hunk, Dale Spranger, but ended up briefly romancing a teenage mutant named Shane Shooter. The leader of a local street gang, his mutant power was to fire beams of energy from his fingertips. Although his attempt to have some alone time with Jubilee was interrupted by a visiting Wolverine, just in case there was any lingering doubt about Logan basically being her dad. Meanwhile, Jubilee's Aunt Hope had adventures of her own as she was secretly a cyborg assassin that clashed with the Chinese Triad alongside her attendant Brad. That whole situation came to a head when Triad enforcers followed Hope back to her home, while Jubilee, Shooter, and Logan were all there. In the ensuing battle, the Lee household was destroyed with Hope inside, and Jubilee believed that her aunt had perished. However, Hope Lee narrowly survived and, after repairing her cybernetics, eventually reunited with Jubilee years later. In the meantime, there was the infamous House of M incident in which the Scarlet Witch mystically depowered the vast majority of the Earth's mutant population. Jubilee was among the millions of mutants affected by this and began running a halfway house for others like herself. But then she was severely injured during a battle between Wolverine and Omega Red. Fortunately, she quickly made a full recovery when Wolverine made a deal with S.H.I.E.L.D., who saved her life in exchange for his cooperation. After that, she was approached by the vigilante Night Thrasher, who recruited her into a new incarnation of the New Warriors, to fight crime while opposing the controversial Superhuman Registration Act. For those familiar with the character, this Night Thrasher was actually Danielle Taylor, the half-brother of the original Night Thrasher, Dwayne Taylor, who was thought to be dead at the time. While no longer possessing her explosive powers, Jubilee used salvaged technology from the then recently destroyed Avengers Mansion to create a new costumed identity, Wondera. She notably wore a pair of gravity wave manipulating gauntlets that were reverse engineered from those worn by the criminal genius Bentley Whitman, the Wizard, which both increased her strength and allowed her to shield herself with an invulnerable force field. Becoming the field leader for these new warriors, all of whom were depowered mutants like herself, Jubilee found a sense of belonging among her new teammates. However, there was some tension between her and Night Thrasher, who initially kept his identity a secret, sometimes manipulated the others with lies, and seemingly had ulterior motives. They eventually learned who he really was, and that his ultimate goal was to build a time machine so that they could prevent the Stamford incident that killed his brother and led to the passing of the Superhuman Registration Act. When this scheme ultimately failed and 2 members of the team were killed, the New Warriors broke up and Jubilee abandoned her Wondera identity.
When the X-Men then relocated to San Francisco with many of the Earth's remaining mutants, Jubilee moved there as well. Meanwhile, there was an incident in which Dracula's son, Zarus, betrayed his father and seized control of the world's various vampire clans. Hoping to create an unstoppable vampire nation by turning the entire mutant population, Zarus sent what could only be described as a vampire suicide bomber into the heart of San Francisco, which exploded in an eruption of blood, infecting Jubilee with a manufactured virus. She began exhibiting some vampiric traits, and when the X-Men failed to cure her, the virus compelled her to seek out Zarus himself, who completed her transformation. When Wolverine then attempted to rescue her, Jubilee turned him as well, which is exactly what Zarus had hoped for. However, the only reason that Wolverine was even able to be infected was because Cyclops had him injected with nanomachines that suppressed his healing factor, and so when the time was right, Cyclops deactivated the nanites, restoring Wolverine to normal and turning the tide of battle against Zarus's vampire forces. In the end, Zarus was defeated and deposed, while Dracula gained control over the vampire nation, and led his people back into the shadows for the time being. Dracula also turned Jubilee over to the X-Men, but of course, she was still infected. She naturally struggled with her vampiric state, but over time developed a measure of control, and used her new supernatural abilities to once again aid Wolverine and the X-Men. She also spent some time learning to control her bloodthirst from a group of vampires called the Forgiven, who survived without feeding on humans. From them she received a magical amulet that protected her from the negative effects of sunlight. During a subsequent adventure, she rescued an orphaned baby boy who she named Shogo, and ended up legally adopting him, thus becoming a mother. While life as a single mom and a vampire was challenging, she was supported by the X-Men, and in particular her old ally, Chamber. Later, during a confrontation with Monet St. Croix, who at the time was merged with her brother Marius, Jubilee was separated from her amulet and knocked outside into the sunlight. Possessing a vestige of the cosmic Phoenix Force, the young mutant Quentin Quire, aka Kid Omega, saved Jubilee's life by expending the remainder of his Phoenix powers to cure her of her vampirism, and in the process reactivated her dormant X gene, restoring her original powers. Since then, Jubilation Lee has continued to fight alongside the X-Men to defend mutant kind while raising her own human child. In her time as an X-Man, she's grown from an inexperienced sidekick into a mentor and mother, and given the untapped potential of her mutant powers, she'll probably continue to grow even stronger. But that is all I have for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!